Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Noel Pearson is a history and law graduate from the University of Sydney and one of Australia's leading thinkers and a man who has dedicated his life to the cause of Indigenous empowerment. As a member of the expert panel on constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians and the Referendum Council, Mr Pearson has been influential on the question of constitutional recognition and was a key advocate for the First Nations Voice proposal announced at the historic Uluru Gathering in May 2017. Mr Pearson comes from southeastern Cape York Peninsula and is the primary architect of the Cape York Agenda. In 1990, he co-founded the Cape York Land Council. Following the Mabo decision of the High Court of Australia, Mr Pearson played a key role in negotiating the Native Title Act 1993 with the federal government. Would you please welcome Mr Noel Pearson.
Thank you, Barton, and thank you to this club for your kind invitation to speak to you at this extremely important time for us. I want to acknowledge the First Nations of this region. We bring greetings from Cape York Peninsula. I want to say firstly, I'm a Queenslander, educated in this town at St Peter's down the road, best years of my life. My Queensland identity comes to the fore when the origin is on and so on. I have many identities, many layers. We all do. Cape York is a singular identity for me. I also identify with my mother and father's First Nation, Guguyimidar people, from Cooktown, the landing point of Captain James Cook in 1770, and my mother's language, Guguyalanji, down towards the Daintree between Cooktown and Port Douglas. We all harbour these various identities in our breasts, and some of them come to the fore. Some of them we share with our family, some of them we do not. I think I'm one of Australia's leading advocates for the greatness of the poet John Milton. None of my family share that passion. Of course, rugby union is a great community that I distinctly share the conviction it is the greatest of all of the games. I thought I was a contender one time, but I was like a Mark Ella brain trapped in a kind of Kim Beazley body. Amartya Sen said that it's a problem when citizens of a nation make fundamental one aspect of their identity, be it religion or political identities or ethnic identities. Sen argued in a 2005 book, Identity and Violence, that we ought to better appreciate the layers of identity that turn over in our breasts and avoid fundamentalism in those identities. We should acknowledge the big communities and small communities that we're part of. And in my observation on Sen's concept of layered identities, I argued that we should connect the two ideas with Robert Putnam's idea in Bowling Alone, that they are bridging and bonding identities. There's identities that bond us to those that are close to us, but we need to create bridges with strangers. And a successful nation is one which has a whole fabric of bonds and bridges. Excuse me for that metaphor. But we need lots of bridges and lots of tight bonds to create a successful multicultural society, a successful nation. And we should abjure the idea that our ethnic or religious identity are somehow identities that trump everything else. We'll not succeed in a multicultural future unless we nurture bonds and bridges. So my Indigenous identity is, of course, extremely important to me, as it is for all Indigenous peoples. But it is not my only identity. As an Australian, I share identities with the Lutherans. I have more brotherhood with people in South Australia, in the Barossa Valley, coming from Germany, because of our religious connection. We have a certain theological view that binds us together, and a history of Lutheran missions that binds us together. So let me urge the idea of layered identities. 2 recommendations were made by the Referendum Council, of which I was a member, to the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. The first proposed a single change to the Australian Constitution. And that change was to enshrine an Indigenous voice to the Parliament, to advise the Parliament in relation to laws and policies affecting Indigenous Australians. Over the course of the past 10 years, probably a dozen ideas have been floated in relation to how this question of recognition might be put into effect. Recognition in the Constitution might be put into effect. And after all of the various inquiries and reports and public consultations, the last of which was a comprehensive process of 12 regional dialogues right across the country, from the Torres Strait to Perth, from Dubbo to Broome, from Cairns to Hobart. These dozen dialogues of Indigenous representatives landed on one constitutional reform, and that is to enshrine the voice. A significant degree of pragmatism was involved in proposing a single, simple proposition. There could have been, the dialogues could have argued that 5 or 6 different changes should have been proposed. But the course of the dialogues led to one inexorable conclusion, which was that the most important measure that needs to be taken is to give Indigenous Australians a voice in the democratic process of the country. That was recommendation number 1. The second recommendation didn't propose any constitutional change. The second idea was for there to be a declaration with no foundation in the law, a declaration akin to the Declaration of Independence in the United States, which has no constitutional foundation. And the idea was put forward by 2 young constitutional conservatives, Damien Freeman and Julian Leeser, MP, where they proposed that the symbolic recognition of our history and the place of Indigenous peoples in Australia be set out not in a preamble to the Constitution, but in a declaration outside of the Constitution. Their argument was that this symbolic recognition would be more handsome and fulsome as a document separate from the basic law of our Constitution. We wouldn't wrangle. We wouldn't have teams of lawyers arguing in a mealy-mouthed way every word in a declaration, as we would necessarily have to do if it was in the Constitution. So those are the 2 ideas. An enshrinement of an Indigenous voice to the Parliament, not a chamber within the Parliament, but the right to advise the Parliament from the outside. So these lurid suggestions that we're proposing a third chamber of Parliament debase the idea that's been put forward. It simply is not correct. In my view, these two ideas are compelling, they are modest, but they are also substantive. They would give effect to the empowerment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and they would advance the cause of reconciliation and closing the most egregious gap in social and economic circumstances of our people. Australia has the most egregious gap between its original peoples and the settlers. There's no country on the face of planet Earth that has the gap that we see in Indigenous Australia. A wealthy country blessed with so much fortune, with a splendid constitution in every respect except in respect of its Indigenous peoples. So the structural change that must happen is that Indigenous people must have a place in the democratic process which enables them to provide official advice to the Parliament in relation to laws and policies that apply to them. Let me say that this whole recognition debate has almost come full circle. The question of how do we recognise Indigenous people has come full circle to the idea that how do we recognise each other? Because to recognise Indigenous people is like looking in a mirror, to finally recognise yourself as Australians. So the idea of the declaration that I would argue is one of mutual recognition. Australians recognising each other because we have never done so. Let me talk about three important dates. The three most significant dates in our epic long history as Australians. The first is 63,000 years before Christ. That is the story of Australia. And it is not the story of Australia that we currently recognise. 63,000 years before Christ, extending up to this date, 25 January 1788. The eve of British colonial annexation of Australia. Imagine that stretch. 63,000 years before Christ, right up, butting up against the day the First Fleet claims sovereignty over the east coast of Australia. That's one part of Australia, and we have made no provision for its recognition as a definition of who we are and what is our heritage. The second important date is, of course, 26 January itself. At Port Phillip, with the annexation of sovereignty over Australia by the British Crown and the settlers coming on the shore and the law of England falling from their shoulders to become the law of the new land. That is a part of Australia that most Australians recognise. There's long been recognition of 26 January 1788. even though at that time there was no Australia. There was only the colony of New South Wales. Australia would never actually come into the parlance until well into the 19th century. And the first official time that the idea of Australia became law was with Federation in 1901. The Commonwealth of Australia became a legal entity in 1901 with Federation. And it was an act of the British Parliament that gave birth to the idea of Australia. The third important date is March 1967, up until 1973, when the last vestiges of the White Australia policy were disbanded. The new Commonwealth of Australia was based on racial preclusion. Not only were the Indigenous not counted in the census, and the Commonwealth Parliament precluded from making laws in relation to them, but Chinese and other aliens were also excluded. And we didn't get rid of the White Australia policy completely until 1973, starting with the Holt government in 1967 and Whitlam in 1973. Those three dates are, to me, the most important, because they define the three parts of Australia. The first part being the Indigenous foundations of this country, the heritage of the country, extending back to such a distant past that it defies our imagination. It defies our imagination, the idea that peoples occupied this land for 65,000 years and made the epic journey out of Africa that long ago. The second part of Australia is, of course, the arrival of the British institutions, the architecture of our democracy, and the arrival of all of the bane and benefit that England had to offer and the British Isles had to offer our nation. Those institutions today, of course, inure for the benefit of all of us, not the least the Chinese and the Indigenous. Those institutions are a great privilege. They form part of the privilege of being Australian. The third part of our story is, of course, the great migrant triumph, the great triumph of multiculturalism. We have made as good on our migrant bounty as any nation has ever done. Those, to me, are the three parts of Australia that we can now recognise in a declaration of mutual recognition. And when we recognise the other, we will recognise ourselves. The declaration is not just a matter of recognising the Indigenous peoples. In fact, a lot of people in the regional dialogues around the country said, why should they recognise us? Shouldn't they receive some recognition from us? Aren't we the ones that should be doing the recognising? So the Declaration of Recognition is one that tells those three stories of Australia. The Indigenous foundations of the country, the British institutions, long may they survive, and our migrant triumph. That is the story of Australia. Finally, we can thread together the story of Australia. The story of Australia is not just 26 January 1788, but 26 January 1788 is, of course, a crucial part of that story. One of the crucial issues in relation to the challenge ahead for us is whether we can enjoin the Australian people in accepting a constitutional referendum that enshrines the voice to the Parliament, a modest but profoundly substantive idea. And the second question is whether we can tell in new poetry our story as a people. Not an exclusive story of 26 January, but a story that tells of the three parts of Australia. My faith is in the Australian people. My faith is not in the politicians. My faith is not in the commentators. My faith is not in the political process. My faith is in the Australian people. And the challenge ahead for us is to ensure that the political leaders have faith in the Australian people, that we can make good on the opportunity. This is a real opportunity for us. This is not the time to kick the can down the road. This is not the time to bequeath to our children and grandchildren an ongoing, festering grievance and alienation. Now is the time. Some generation has to step up and do that which we have not done for 110 years. So my faith is in the Australian people. The gift of constitutional change is a gift of the Australian people, which is why I've been a steadfast believer that conservative Australians are capable of leading this change. I've always said Nixon has got to go to China, and I've worked assiduously with conservative constitutional advocates on the idea that we can uphold the Australian Constitution whilst at the same time recognising Indigenous Australians. Do not be cynical about this. Do not be cynical about past experience. This is not like any other constitutional change. This is a profound question about the nature of Australia and our identity as Australians. I say that some of the commentary, sadly from some political leaders, is verballing the Australian people. They say the Australian people are meaner than we think they are, that they are too conservative to embrace a change, that they are too fearful of the changes that are proposed, that they will not be capable of understanding the issues at stake. Well, I say to those people who say that they're verballing the Australian people. That is not the Australian people I sense. Our strongest advocates in this debate over the recent years have come from the conservative end of the spectrum. Those people who think about the Constitution every day. They're our strongest constituency. One of the most effective organisations in disseminating some of the ideas that have finally landed, not the least the idea of a declaration, is a group of constitutional conservatives who have opposed changes to the Constitution in the past. These are people who safeguard the Constitution, but they believe the Constitution can be upheld and yet recognise Indigenous Australians. So to this club I say, you're Queenslanders, we need the people of Queensland and the media and political leadership of this state to be at the forefront. All of the great issues in Indigenous affairs have happened in this state, Eddie Mabo not the least. All of the great changes and the reforms have come from Queensland. And we need this club and the political leadership of this state to understand that we must lead the country. We must lead the country. This is a chance that that comes around so infrequently. And we're in the 10th year of our advocacy of this opportunity, and I feel that within the next year we have the real opportunity for Australians to put their hands up for this reform. And as I say, this is a question ultimately to be determined by the Australian people, and I believe the Australian people yearn for the resolution of this issue. What is this whispering in our hearts that the great colonial lawyer Richard Windeyer asked in Sydney town in the middle of the 19th century? He said, what is this whispering in our hearts? And so we have now a real opportunity, as long as the politics can thread together, and as long as we have the goodwill and not the cynicism from our public commentators and media and political leaders, I believe we can reach a genuine reconciliation of the original peoples and this great nation. Thank you.
Hello. Is that working? Yes. Thank you very much, Noel. I'll be throwing over to the media in the room to ask you some questions shortly, but I thought I'd start off with one, if you don't mind. You articulated very clearly two outcomes from the work that you've been doing over the past couple of years. If the Prime Minister and the Opposition Leader were sitting in the audience here today, what would you ask them to do now, and when do you want them to do it by?
I think we can have a referendum in May next year, the 51st anniversary of the 67 referendum. In order to do that, we need a bill passed through Parliament putting the question at the earliest in December this year or up until March next year. Our Constitution says no more than 6 months, but no less than 2 before the referendum date. So my proposition to them would be, you have got to organise the politics to get the bill through the House by the end of this year or early next. I would say to them, listen, we've been on this for 10 years. You set up a referendum council. It had Murray Gleeson, former Chief Justice, the driest black-letter lawyer you can find, who's formulated these propositions. So we're in the best state. I would say that Turnbull and Shorten need to organise the politics to get the question put to a referendum, as I say, in May next year.
And for a referendum to carry, we need a majority of votes in a majority of states. It's had a very challenging history, referenda changes in Australia. In your travels, do you think the sentiment and the commitment is there? You've just talked about leadership from Queensland as you wrapped up. Is the intent and the will there, do you think, from the Australian community to achieve both those outcomes?
I think the hurdle presented by the Australian people is like that. the hurdle presented by the Parliament is like that. And my view is that if we had a clear run to the Australian people, we would succeed. It's the political process that causes confusion and dismay in the electorate. I sense that, you know, we've held out on this question a long time. Who really wants to bequeath to our children, an Australia that still hasn't resolved itself? I just think people want peace in relation to this matter. Australians from across the spectrum, even those that might be considered unsympathetic to Indigenous people, in terms of the parlous place of our people in this country, even they want the problems resolved. So, you know, I think, you know, it's how well we go will depend on the quality of our political leadership.
I'll pass over to journos now. If you could please introduce yourself and your media organisation when you ask your question.
Thank you very much. Sarah Elks from the Australian newspaper. Mr. Pearson, thank you very much for your address. I know you say you have great faith in the Australian people, but not quite as much faith in our political leadership. Are there plans for a formal lobbying or advertising campaign to ensure that your message gets clearly through to the Australian people that you need to vote yes at a referendum?
Yes, once we've got everybody on the same page in relation to the model, and the great thing that Murray Gleeson and the writers of the Referendum Council's report have done here is that they've simplified the whole thing down to 2 propositions, and really 1 proposition in relation to the Constitution. And once we have agreement on that question, then we would anticipate that the government needs to support a campaign to explain the proposition to the Australian people and to make the case for yes. That is crucial. Over the past 6-7 years of polling, there's been a great latent pool of goodwill. That's been very clear to us from that there's a pool of goodwill across the political divide, and interestingly, for an issue such as this, across generations as well. There's as much support from the polling amongst older Australians for recognition as there is for younger Australians. So there really is a latent pool of support for this. Of course, once we agree a model, then a campaign needs to be undertaken with full vigour.
And you say that the government needs to support such a campaign. Do you mean in terms of some substantial funding? Do they need to throw some money behind this? Does the Referendum Council have any cash to do something like this? And would you like to see them design the campaign, or would you like to see them instead just sort of hand over the financial backing and then have it led by the Referendum Council, for instance?
Yeah, well, there's discussions going on now about how that phase needs to operate. The recognised campaign that's been conducted over the last 6-7 years is now giving way to this new phase. I think that there's the level of awareness across the Australian landscape is still it's still not very deep, and a lot more work will need to be done by all parties, including through an official government-sponsored awareness campaign, in order to get Australians up to speed with the propositions. But the proposition at the end of the day boils down to a single, in my mind anyway, to a simple proposition is, should Indigenous Australians have a voice to the Parliament in relation to laws and policies that affect them?
Felicity Caldwell from Brisbane Times. You've said that Conservative Australians are capable of leading this change, and you've had great things to say about the National Party, salt of the earth types. What do you think about the Labor Party and One Nation?
Well, obviously when you've got a challenge like majority of voters in a majority of the states, you've got to have a strategy that starts at about 5 o'clock on the political spectrum and work backwards. So, the decent end of the National Party. In fact, I've said publicly many times that our best supporters come from the National Party. Just instinctive, right? I go around Parliament House and the best reception I get is from National Party politicians. I think because I hunt down at that end of the clock, I kind of neglect the left side of the clock a bit, and they go AWOL on us. And so we had this strange situation where our best supporters came from the right, and the left, the Labor were sending very inconsistent messages after the Uluru Statement. That dismayed me. That there was that people weren't on the same page in relation to the Uluru Statement. I think that is now diminished over the past 2 months, and we're getting a very clear message from the Leader of the Opposition about where Labor stands in relation to this. But the dissonance that occurred over the last 2 months was not helpful to us. It was most unfortunate. But that was because the assumption was that everybody to the left of the right should have been easy to get on board. And unfortunately, that didn't entirely take place.
Thank you, Mr. Pearson, for taking the time to speak with us. My name is Sonia Colbach. I'm from Australian Associated Press. I want to know your thoughts on whether the same-sex marriage debate is perhaps pushing further away the debate and I guess the very public debate that's needed around this to try to perhaps spur leadership into organising the politics, as you say.
I'm hoping not. I don't think it need be the case. I only make the observation that if we don't deal with a referendum in the life of this Parliament, we will definitely be kicking this can down the road. I think if there is not a commitment to running a referendum in the life of this Parliament, we will lose this opportunity, in my view. This is our best chance to deal with it. Yes, a number of constitutional reform propositions have been floated by the Leader of the Opposition, a republic, 4-year parliamentary terms and so on. I would just urge that those issues be definitely put back to another term and a time in the future. It would be grossly unfair if the Indigenous recognition referendum is not first cab off the rank for a referendum.
Can I ask you about a slightly different issue? We're anticipating that we're going to have an election called in Queensland at any moment, or any moment between now and at the very latest May next year. I just wanted to ask you, the Cape York Institute and Balcanoe and the Cape York Land Council have been very vocal in their concerns about some of this government's policies in terms of the tightening of tree clearing legislation and also the not very well publicised Pristine Rivers policy, which your brother has said recently is a bit like Wild Rivers revived. I'm just wondering what your plans are in terms of taking, obviously you're very busy with constitutional recognition, but what the Cape York group might be doing when the election is called, whether you'll take an active role in campaigning on those issues as you did in the electorate of Ashgrove in 2015.
Well, our argument from Cape York is that if we're going to have a future that is brighter than the one we've had, we've got to build empowerment from the ground, which is why we've championed welfare reform, why we champion a philosophy of personal and family responsibility. We abjure victimhood. We say that economic development and jobs and getting out of welfare is all part of the empowerment of our people. Those are agendas that we've sought to build from the ground up. Personal responsibility is key. Family responsibility is key, we say, and we don't resile from that. But at the same time, there's got to be structural change as well. Individuals and families can't just rise up out of the ashes and beat their way to a better life against all of the structural circumstances they live in terms of their relationship with government and their disempowerment at a structural level. So that's why we champion constitutional change and empowerment from the bottom. They're complementary agendas. We have to do both. Lots of people say, listen, we support you on the empowerment, but we really don't think the constitutional stuff is necessary. And another group of people say, oh, good on you for the constitutional stuff, but we hate, why are you going on about welfare reform? Well, our argument is that you've got to do both. You need to build the thing from the bottom up, but you also need to tackle the structural situation of our disempowerment, our lack of voice. Why do you think the laws and policies are so poor? It's because we don't have a voice in relation to them. So that's the kind of, I'm avoiding the political question in your argument, Sarah, but our argument to the Queensland government will always be, if you cut out from under our feet the means for developing an economy, well, how are we going to succeed? We've got millions and millions of hectares of land back in our hands as a result of Mabo, and then you want to stop us from developing it? What kind of future is there for us if the government just simply puts a green blanket over the top of everything? Of course, protecting the environment is part of our future as well, but this agenda that we have steadfastly fought against, and we will continue to steadfastly fight against, this agenda of simply putting green regimes to stop people from using their land is really a prescription for miserable poverty into the future. And we don't accept that. And we don't accept that Brisbane, George Street, has got a right to make deals in relation to our land without us being involved. And which is why our fight with Labor in this state has been so bitter. Because they're wrong. Paul Keating supported Mabo, our right to land, and he certainly didn't support the idea that the Labor Party should then go and take over the land with green blankets. We have supported the creation of many millions of hectares of national park in Cape York. People don't understand that. We have made the compromises. We have made provision for environmental protection. But the problem with the Greens, of course, the extreme Greens, is that they want to take half of it and then they want to come after the other half. And we've rejected that. And we've not had a great deal of support from this town, from this city, in relation to our struggle. It has been a lonely struggle. The political and business sphere here in Brisbane has been slow to support us. And it's not in relation to current development proposals. I'm thinking about 30 years' time when our people want to develop something and they find out they simply cannot do so because it was all locked up with wild rivers and everything else. So yes, we will, Sarah, the blunt answer is that yes, we will fight the imposition of regimes that we don't support, because we cannot have the bottom-up economic development and job creation take place if environmental laws simply prevent it.
Felicity Caldwell again. I just wanted to ask you about good to great schools. Are you hoping to get back into Arakoon School?
Sorry?
I wanted to ask about good to great schools. Are you hoping to get back into Arakoon School with your program?
Yeah, it's the greatest heartbreak of my life, losing that school. I'm not in public life to lose things like that. Those children are my most precious anxiety. And I don't believe that Kate Jones and Jim Waterston have done the right thing by those children. So yes, I harbour that hope and dream, not for my sake, but for theirs. Some of those children who went through our academy are now at Maris Brothers Ashgrove. They're playing in the rugby teams. They're at St. Peter's. Those kids that graduated from our academy are scattered throughout Brisbane. I want more of their younger people to join them. So I don't believe that whole episode was at all a fair episode. Essentially, that school got shut down for a law and order problem down the street for nothing that was happening in the school. And Waterston has to be held to account for that.
Will you be writing to the Education Minister to ask to get back in Arakoon School?
Yeah, they know our position on that. I think that this whole question of fixing up the schools in remote areas is still a big agenda for us. We can't urge parents to take up their responsibilities in relation to sending their children to school if the school itself is not teaching them. And too many of our schools here in Queensland are preparatory institutions for incarceration. They prepare kids for juvenile detention and later adult imprisonment. That's the pathway. If you have school failure, if you have reading failure, you have juvenile detention, and then you have imprisonment. And that is why we are the most imprisoned people in the world per population. ABC did a fact check on my assertion about that. I made an assertion that we are the most imprisoned people per population on earth. ABC fact checked it out, and they had to say, yeah, it's true. And of course, the engine for the production of these detainees in juvenile detention and in prison, the engine ultimately is failed schooling. The direct correlation between kids who can't read and the kids who are in jail. So the Queensland education system has got a long way to go. These remote Indigenous schools are the poorest in the country. And you know, I see no sign. I see no sign that there's any kind of serious strategy to turn that situation around.
Mr. Pearson, you said that in order to push ahead with constitutional recognition that Turnbull and Shorten needed to organise the politics. Are they capable of doing so, in your opinion?
Of course, to be frank, Turnbull's problem is that he's worried that the people on the right of the party are going to pull the rug out from under him if he takes any kind of courageous stand on recognition. And he's frozen. He's frozen by that, as he is in relation to a host of other issues. But, you know, at the end of the day, politics is about trying to find the way forward to unplait the knot and try to organise the politics. You know, I'm a great reader of the life of Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he achieved civil rights. One of the things he did, though, he had a long game going back to when he was just a congressman. He was thinking about this stuff decades before. And he played a long game in relation to thinking about civil rights. And of course, you know, he also, this wasn't just a, oh, what's the next issue on the agenda item? Oh, conrec. You know, it was on his agenda all the time, when it was on the agenda of nobody else, other than the African American leaders. So we don't have anybody like that who is completely passionate and diligent and hard-headed about organising the politics here. We are completely dependent on political leaders who are seeing this, all right, conrec, what do we do? Who do we, you know? And as a result, I think they discount what's possible simply because they haven't given enough thought to it and organise the deep logic. I'd say one thing, Barton, going and building alliances with the conservative right has a deep logic to it. It is a necessary deep logic to get the Australian people on board. Because if we can answer the real concerns that conservatives have about a safe amendment that doesn't derogate from the supremacy of Parliament, that doesn't mean that there's court challenges before the High Court and so on, unintended consequences. If we address all of those things, then a deep logic comes into play. And Professor Greg Craven from the Australian Catholic University, one of the most conservative universities in the country, he is the #1 ticket holder for this concept, and has been a strong proponent of our proposal. And it's because he has satisfied himself in relation to the logic of this idea and has been instrumental in urging us to move forward with it.
One final question before we wrap up, Noel. Taking into account everything that you've spoken about today, on the pendulum of being positive or negative with respect to the outcomes of the voice and recognition, are you on the positive or negative side, and how far on which side are you feeling at this moment?
This is an idea that actually, Greg Craven said this, lots of constitutional reform proposals lose support as time goes on. This is the one he observed actually gains support the more people come to understand it. And I believe Greg's right in relation to that, which gives me the optimism that once we have the politics sorted out and the Prime Minister is able to say that this is the right idea and urge the Australian people to give full consideration to it, I believe we can get a groundswell of support. I think the declaration is as important as the constitutional change, and it is in the declaration that there is something in it for everybody. You know, the voice is in relation to Indigenous people, but the declaration is really for the whole nation. It is a declaration of mutual recognition. And once that idea, I believe, takes hold amongst ordinary Australians, they will see that actually this is speaking to me. This is speaking to my mob and our place in the nation. So Barton, I'm optimistic. I'm a great believer that the Australian people will rise to this occasion.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank Mr. Noel Pearson.